And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, and blessed be God Most High. From Genesis 14:18-20. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. John 14:6. Henceforth let no man trouble me, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. From the Epistle to the Galatians, chapter 6, verse 17. So welcome back. Here to talk about letter 5 from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, the letter on the Pope. Now, like we talked last time with the Emperor, Tomberg describes the Pope as a post, a necessary post in human life. You know, I don't mean individual human life. I mean human life writ large. It's a station, and it's necessary. And even if he mentions, if it were to be, all but disappeared from the face of the earth, if it gone completely underground, it's still the post is necessary as the post of the emperor is necessary. It's kind of a mysterious statement. Now, right away, Tomberg jumps into the idea of this card connected to the pillars in particular, and into the cross that the Pope holds, into his gesture of benediction. How this card corresponds to prayer and benediction. And he notes that one of the pillars we can think of it as prayers ascending on the pillar, and we can think of the other one as benediction descending, coming from on high. And he connects this also to what he calls respiration, spiritual respiration, which is fascinating. And he talks about the blood, the oxidization of the blood, which purifies it and brings health. Similarly, the prayer, which reaches to heaven, reaches God and comes back as benediction. So it's like it's carrying away anxiety and bringing back health and grace. It's an important features in this letter. So and he also talks about two different kinds of respiration in another one of Tomberg's crosses, right? So he's got the horizontal respiration, outside and inside, and vertical respiration, the above and below. And the vertical respiration, which is what we should aspire to, according to Tomberg, signifies it's the alteration between prayer and benediction. That's the respiration he's interested in, and that's the one that the Pope signifies in this card. So kind of it starts off right away and gets us straight into our own meditation on what prayer is and what benediction is. And he says on here on page 100 in my edition, there are two kinds of respiration: horizontal respiration, which takes place between outside and inside, and vertical respiration, which takes place between above and below. The sting of death, or the essential crisis of the supreme agony, is the abrupt passage from horizontal to vertical respiration. Yet he who has learnt vertical respiration whilst living will be spared from this sting of death. For him, the passage from one form of respiration to the other will not be of the nature of a right angle, but rather the arc of a circle. The transition will not be abrupt but gradual and curved instead of rectangular. So we'll take away the sting of death. I went through a rather morbid period. No, I went through a period where I was thinking about the deaths of certain people and how people die. This probably had to be some in some way connected with my own father's death, watching him die, and and seeing the change in him, not necessarily for the better, but when we're finally faced with that, how we deal with it. And I thought, so some of the figures I examined, and I even wrote some poetry on this. William Blake, for instance, the romantic poet, visionary, artist. Now, when he died, he had been sick for a while. He was an old man, and he had been sick for a while, and they were anticipating his death, and he was in bed, and all of a sudden, when his moment came, he sat up in bed, singing about the glories he saw and revealed in heaven, and that's how he went out. And that would be a wonderful way to die. On the other hand, Aleister Crowley, whom we've spoke of before, when he died, his last words were, "I am confused." I don't think that's a good way to go. So which way do you want to go? And I think what Tomberg is pointing out to here is that maybe Blake was more connected to vertical respiration, and obviously it was. And Crowley, who was really so invested in his own will, was stuck in it. As we'll get into later, the will is an important feature of this letter. What the will does to us, and what it is in our own human nature. So maybe Crowley, though, he was so invested in the will that he was not able to make that transition with the grace with which Blake had. I mean, Blake, lived in relative obscurity, hardly published anything during his lifetime, and yet that's the way I would prefer to go that way. So, and he talks about different kinds of prayer, which is, I think it's particularly important, because often people think they're not, praying or engaging in some kind, formal prayers, the rosary or whatever it happens to be, that they're not really praying, or maybe that they're not invested in contemplation, a kind of formal contemplation or meditation practice, that they're not praying. But in my own experience, what Tomberg talks about here rings true, and here's what he says. And this is the bottom of page 100. He said, the thirst for truth is fundamentally a prayer. Right? So the thirst for truth is fundamentally a prayer. So let's start there. And I think most people, a lot of people who eventually come to Tomberg's work or other things, even yoga, TM, they're thirsting for truth. And it seems to me, maybe I'm just really wrong, it seemed like a much more common thing when I was a young man than it is today. Don't know. But the thirst for truth, truth, beauty, and goodness. That's what, when I became a professor, that was my inspiration. That's what I wanted to pursue and I wanted to bring to students. Unfortunately, I was in academia. And so this is the first place he starts with. That's a kind of prayer, a thirst for truth. And he continues. And the illumination by which it may be followed is the corresponding benediction of grace. True suffering also is fundamentally always a prayer. And the consolation, peace, and joy which can follow are the effects of the benediction or grace corresponding to it. So suffering is also a kind of prayer. interesting. I mean, later he'll talk about Mahayana Buddhism, and we've talked a little bit about the Buddhist view of suffering. But suffering can be a prayer. It's interesting to take that into our experience. How could it be a prayer? It's worth thinking about. And then he says, true effort of the will, that is 100% effort, true work, is also a prayer. True work is also a prayer. What's true work? What do you mean by true? What's the it's an explosive adjective. True work. What is true work? You ever look on LinkedIn? You think everybody, the whole world is about making money, capitalism, selling product. Which is that true work? Is it selling product? I mean, it's very necessary. I mean, hey, I'm using an iPhone to record this video. I'm very thankful for that. But what's true work? What is true work? And then he goes on to give some examples, but he doesn't get too precise. He says, true effort of the will, when it is intellectual work, it is prayer. Hallowed be thy name. When it is creative work, or creative effort, it is prayer. The kingdom come. When it is work with a view to supplying for the material needs of life, it is prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. And all these forms of prayer in the language of work have their corresponding benedictions or graces. So it makes us think differently about work. How can your work be prayer? And in what circumstances could it be prayer? I think in the helping professions, it's pretty easy to see how it could be prayer. And even in scholarship, what I do, you can see how it would be prayer, or farming, writing poetry, things I do. They're kind of forms of prayer for me. Even before reading this, I really consider those forms of prayer because they're forms of attention, and they're forms of reverence that come about in each of those contexts. With letting what is before you speak. It's a kind of prayer. But in more kind of mainstream occupations, how could we let those be prayer as well? And I'm sure we could. And I think it probably has mostly to do with our disposition. And how would a hermeticist work at a bank? Tom Burke worked for the BBC, So you could think that was working for the man, but was that his work, or was what he was doing at night when he was writing these meditations his work? What is our, and this is another kind of tangential point, but vocation. What is your vocation? Vocare, to call. What are you called to? What are you called to? And I think everyone is called to a vocation. It might not be how they make their living, but they're called to a vocation. And then he talks about how there are 3 levels of horizontal respiration, which are love of nature, love of one's nature, and love of the beings of the spiritual hierarchies, which as we talked before, these are kind of implicit features of Hermeticism, right? It's cosmologically configured. Nature, the neighbor, the hierarchies. And then the 3 stages of vertical respiration are purification, illumination, and mystical union, which are the traditional stages of the spiritual life. And then Tom Berg moves into this discussion, he's setting up a discussion about how the offices of emperor and pope are related and how they're different. The emperor he calls the master of the day and the guardian of the blood, or quintessence of the nocturnal reality of the day. And the pope is the guardian of respiration, or of the reality of the relationship between day and night. And this is on page 103, if you're interested. And he talks later that the guardian of the night, or the master of the night, will be discussed in the Hermit. But before he gets to that, as he's setting that up, there's an interesting sidelight, and we'll talk a little bit about this, because I think it's important. A lot of people miss out on this, and I think it's worth considering. Now, obviously, from what we've been talking about, Tomberg knows a lot about Buddhism and a lot about Vedanta. And he circles back to Buddhism here. And he says, this is on page 102, talking about this nocturnal, there's the gospel of the day and there's a gospel that works at night. Does that like with Nicodemus in John 3? Thus, when the gospel was preached by the light of day in the countries around the Mediterranean, the nocturnal rays of the gospel effected a profound transformation of Buddhism. Right? There, the ideal of individual liberation by entering the state of nirvana gave way to the idea of renouncing nirvana for the work of mercy towards suffering humanity. The ideal of Mahayana, the great chariot, then had its resplendent ascent to the heaven of Asia's moral values. Now, what he's talking about is in Mahayana Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, is around the time, and this is actually verifiable, around the time of Christ, while Christ was preaching and actually living out this sacrificial love. That's at that same time in Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, the idea of the bodhisattva arose. So it kind of arose simultaneously. And with this, what we have is, the bodhisattva, if you don't know, is someone a Buddha who renounces nirvana until everyone can be enlightened. This is kind of a very tangential movie reference, but in the movie Dunkirk, if you've seen that, my favorite character is the one played by Kenneth Branagh, and he's like a bodhisattva figure for me in that film, because he decides he will not be saved until everyone's saved. It's a beautiful moment. My children are watching that movie and they ask, "Who's your favorite character?" That was why, because he wouldn't go until everyone could go. That's a bodhisattva gesture right there. And we might get into it here, but in anthroposophical circles, there's a kind of a whispering in some Tombergian circles as well, that Valentin Tomberg was the Maitreya Buddha, the Western Buddha. And their anthroposophists have written book-length harangues about this. They really don't like Tomberg at all. They feel like he's a splitter. But it's worth thinking about. I don't think Tomberg made as big a deal out of it as other people make it out of it. But anyway, to go back to this idea of the Mahayana stream, the bodhisattva vow to not be enlightened before everybody else can enter into nirvana. That's got a heavily Christian resonance to it. Likewise, and this is also a little bit tangentially related, in Hinduism, there's the Kalki avatar, the rider on a white horse, who seems to have, and even some mainstream scholars have recognized, they saw some Christian influence from the Book of Revelation in the idea of the Kalki avatar. And just this is some Michael Martin trivia, right? I've never told anybody this. I think my wife knows about this. In about 1987, 86, whenever the harmonic convergence was, I was meditating on Lake Huron, and I had this vision of the Kalki avatar coming across Lake Huron. Apparently, it was coming from Canada. I don't know what it meant, but actually, I was pretty good friends with a lot of Hare Krishnas and Hindus at the time, and one of them was she was a priestess, a Krishna priest or a Hindu priestess, and I told her about it. She said, "Oh yeah, I haven't thought about Kalki for a long time, but I think you're onto something." Now I don't know what that means. I don't know what that experience was telling me, but it was pretty profound at the time. But similarly, there are Christian resonances in some of those features, and apparently, from what I understand, the Kalki story, I guess you could call it, didn't appear in Vedantic literature until around the time, the early modern or early common era, right? So could be related, could be not related, but always seems related to me. And then he's talking about the Bodhisattva here on page 103. I think it's one of his finer moments, and I think it's certainly worth thinking about. So here's what he says. And the act of separation of the intelligible from the mysterious signifies at the same time the establishing of cosmic respiration, which is the analogy of the Spirit of God moving above the face of the waters. For the divine breath, Ruach Elohim, above the profoundness of peace, the waters, it is this which is the psychological as well as the cosmic reality of nirvana, is the divine prototype of respiration. Therefore, the great chariot, the Mahayana of Buddhism, raises itself towards the divine breath. The mercy which moves above the waters of the pre-cosmic peace of nirvana, whilst the little chariot, the Hinayana, aspires toward the end of respiration. Its aim is to be drowned in the waters of peace, to enter into nirvana, where there is no movement, neither change nor respiration. But the divine breath, the Ruach Elohim, is above the ocean of peace of nirvana. The divine breath moves it, and to renounce nirvana after having arrived at its threshold means to say, rise above nirvana and participate in the divine breath transcending it. Now, what's wonderful about this, I think, is not that he's trying, and I don't think he is, trying to do some kind of religious syncretism, kind of perennialist approach where all things lead to God, kind of a universalist approach. Not at all. I think what he's saying, and he knows Vedanta and Buddhism very well, but what he's saying is that, how does a Christian think about these things? We don't want to really dismiss other religions as devil worship or whatever, but there is truth in them, right? And our job is to acknowledge truth. And he sees this wonderful proof, I would say, of not only what the Genesis teaches, but what Catholic theology teaches about sacrifice. Okay, and from there, he gets into this kind of interesting moment for us postmodern types, where he talks about the different kinds of truth. Now, I wonder, so he died in 1973. Had he lived to see deconstruction in its full flowering later that decade and into the 80s, nobody would have thought. There's no such thing as an author. There's no truth. Truth is relative. But he kind of anticipates it right here and diffuses it. Because for Tomberg, the Pope and the office of Pope is dedicated to a truth which comprises harmonious respiration. And for that, what that means is, or his example for this, and he says, the blood that issued from Christ onto the earth is precious to such a degree that he gave the earth the central position in the space of noumenal values. And we talked about this a little bit already, the significance of that event, of the crucifixion, and in the crucifixion of Christ's blood and water, we'll talk about in a second, touching the earth. Giving, it just, at that moment, the geocentric model became the truth. Even though people accepted it until then, or until, say, the early modern period, it became the moral truth. And this is one of the truths that Tomberg's talking about, the logic of facts and the logic of morality. And as a moral truth, the geocentric is representative of, or the geocentric model of the universe is representative of moral truth, because it puts the earth, which is where Christ gave his blood to the earth, at the center. And you notice, if you're not familiar with this, but the astrological glyph for the earth is a circle with a cross on the top of it. So that's ground zero. That's ground zero. And here's what he says about these two models of the universe. So the geocentric cosmos is therefore true from the point of view of respiration. That is, from the point of view of the life of prayer and benediction. And the heliocentric cosmos, although it has the support of all the facts of the phenomenal world, is false because it fails to recognize that which is truly central, the incarnation of the Word, and replaces it by a center situated more at the periphery, removed from the central value. Right? So this is what he calls moral truth, right? That the geocentric model is true. It's truer than the factually true heliocentric model of the solar system, because Christ's blood touched this. It had this numinal influence on the earth, which made it the center of the universe. And then he talks a little bit more about reincarnation, as we talked last time. He's trying to get in more trouble in case he didn't get enough trouble last time. But again, he keeps bringing Buddhism into conversation, especially Mahayana Buddhism, into conversation with Christian truth. And I think rather than, that kind of perennialist approach, he really believes it will be subsumed into the Catholic Church, right, at one time in the future. And then he talks about this idea of the wound. Now, what is a wound? A wound is that by which the outside world can enter the inside, the inwardly biological world, right? So, or even inward psychological world as well, spiritual world. So, Christ on Calvary, he's wounded, his blood comes forth, enters the earth, but also by his wounds, by his stripes are we healed. We can enter into him. I think that's a fundamental truth of Christianity, is that we belong to this religion where, our God decided to participate in what we suffer through, in the worst possible way. So I'll follow a guy like that. I'll take that God over someone who's never felt pain, never had to suffer. And so he's talking about this idea of the wound, and it's not only is that a wound. I mean, if we get a wound too, we have to cover it, we have to disinfect it, because we don't want what's outside there, bacteria, whatever, to come in, so we don't get infected. But he points out how the senses are all wounds. The eyes, he talks about the eyelids being kind of retractable skin over these wounds called our eyes. And isn't it the truth? Now, even though wonderful things can come into our eyes, Goethe talked about us receiving nourishment through the eyes by beholding beauty. But on the other hand, we receive plenty of wounds or infections through the wounds of our eyes. Say if you even mistakenly encounter, by accident, encounter pornography. It hurts. It's a wound. I mean, it's an infection. It's damaging. Or, how many things do we see that are just not good for us? And it doesn't have to be pornography. It could be the news. Could be the horrible in talk radio or television broadcast news. The way people treat one another. It's hurtful. But also, we all have this experience where so you're driving along the highway and you get stopped at a light and there's a homeless person right next to you. Now, people have the experience of hiding their eyes, diverting their gaze to not make eye contact with the homeless person. Now, why? I would suggest that it hurts to see that person like that. It also hurts if we don't have anything to give that person, if we feel helpless, and it also hurts that person when they see us divert our gaze, So the eyes are wounds, and so are the other senses. Simone Weil, the French philosopher and mystic, talked about her time working in factories, listening to the bosses treat the workers with absolute brutality, she called it, and she described it as a kind of laceration, a cut. It's a wound. Then he discusses, in relationship to the wound, the pentagram, which is the symbol of the 5 wounds. And the 5 wounds he's talking about, he says on page 111, he says they correspond to the 5 dark currents of the will. The desire for personal greatness, to take, to keep, to advance, and to hold on to at the expense of others. Right? Those are all wounds. And this is where he's talking quite a bit about the will in this example. Let me see if we can find it. And now think about this. Right? Where does original sin take place? Is it the flesh? Is our body the problem? Do animals sin? No. Is it in our minds? Or is it, as Tom Berg suggests and others have suggested, is it when our will inserts itself into our minds and then thereby influences the flesh? Here's what he says, page 111. Thus it is not thought as such which allows the desire for personal greatness or the tendency toward megalomania, but rather the will, which makes use of the head and which can take hold of thought and reduce it to the role of its instrument. And this constitutes the second reason as to why the 5th wound, that of organic humility, replacing the current of the will to greatness, is not found in the head, but rather in the heart. Remember we talked earlier about Aleister Crowley. I mean, what is the do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, right? It's the will. And I think that's probably why his last words were, I am confused. It didn't go out like William Blake. Right? And Tom Berg talks about, this is a human tendency. We think we can just do it in our heads, right? Without the heart. And there's a cruelty to that kind of cold, logical approach to things. And he said, this is why many thinkers and scientists want to think without the heart in order to be objective, which is an illusion. Because one can in no way think without the heart being the activating principle of thought. What can one do is to think with a humble and warm heart instead of with a pretentious and cold heart. Right? And this is where he kind of takes that idea of the pentagram away from the boogity occultists, who want to discuss, the devil pentagram, or what have you, and he's grounding it in Christian tradition, which is why he, right after this, moves into a discussion of the 3 vows. But before that, I wanted to talk about him something. Let's see right here. Because he gets into it's in. Well, I'll get it as we go through this. So we're talking about the 3 vows, right? Obedience, poverty, and chastity, right? Those are the three vows that monks take. What are they? The vow of poverty, this is 112, is the practice of inner emptiness, which is established as a consequence of the silence of personal desires, emotions, and imagination, so that the soul is capable of receiving from above the revelation of the Word, the life and the light. Right? So it's poverty. Not just living without stuff, but it's really a disciplining of the will. Inner emptiness. Right? Vow of obedience is the practice of silencing personal desires, emotions, and imagination in the face of reason and conscience. It is the primacy of the ideal as opposed to the apparent, the nation as opposed to the personal, humanity as opposed to the nation, and God as opposed to humanity. So notice how it becomes hierarchical. In a lot of this, I think he draws from St. Thomas Aquinas, and that's why he wrote his dissertation on jurisprudence in the light of Aquinas. So I think this is why he's getting a little political here. And then he talks about the vow of chastity, and that means putting into practice of the resolution to live according to solar laws without covetousness and without indifference. Chastity is the state of the human being where the center named in Occidental esotericism as the 12-petaled lotus, Anahata in Indian esotericism, is awakened and becomes the sun of the microcosmic planetary system. Well, it's the heart chakra. That's what he's talking about. And he talks, in a wonderful moment, he talks about when they do this, the person is chaste, no matter whether he or she is celibate or married. Thus, there are virgins who are married and mothers of children, and there are physical virgins who are not so in reality. The ideal of the Virgin Mother that the traditional church, Catholic and Orthodox, puts forward is truly worthy of reverence. It is the ideal of chastity, which triumphs over sterility and indifference. And Jakob Burma, for instance, when he talks about the virginity of Sophia or the Virgin Mary, it's based on purity more than an intact hymen. It's about purity. I mean, the level of purity that is virginity itself. That's what the Virgin Sophia is. And that's why it's connected also to fertility, fecundity, and against, as Tomberg says here, sterility and indifference. And then, in relationship to this idea of the practice of chastity, he does something I think is pretty interesting, right? Talking about all the problems, and he has a great quote from Josephine Péladan about the temptations that occultists and others have to be seduced by the aesthetic of occultism and infatuated with the quaint and strange, right? You know, some occultists wearing a cape. You know, take the cape off. You don't need to create an atmosphere around yourself. One is has subscribed to the amusements of nervous females. One has sought thrills, the thrill of the invisible and the beyond. One has asked for the excitement of the incorporeal. Right? That's Péladan's criticism. And right after that, Tomberg goes into how does this operate through gender? And he says, the practice of chastity holds fast the leanings of the hunter in the human being, of which the male side is inclined to pursue game and the female side to set traps. Now we talked a little bit about this before, but Joseph Campbell also talked about this in, I think, a video I saw. Now that's interesting. So the male, and I think this is also connected to the way that the reproductive organs are situated in men versus women. In men, they're external. In men in primitive societies are the hunters, where women in primitive societies, so-called, set the traps. I mean, it's a picture of it's biology right there. And that's with chastity, right? He says, it holds fast the leanings of the hunter and the human, right? Where the male side is inclined to pursue gain, and the female side is to set traps. The practice of poverty binds the tendencies of the thief in the human being, where the male side is inclined to seize, and the female side to keep indefinitely, instead of waiting for the free gift or the merited fruit of work. And the practice of obedience, lastly, rivets the will to greatness, or the inclinations of the usurper in human nature, whose male side is inclined to estimate itself great in its own eyes, and whose female side seeks to make itself estimated so in the eyes of others. Now, we could, in our day and age, we could deconstruct that. But I think, going back to what he was saying earlier, with moral truth, right, rather than changeable truths, he's grounding this, I think, in biology, but also in Genesis. And that doesn't mean that there aren't women who hunt and men who set traps, for instance, right? But there's more to it than that. And then after this, he moves into a discussion of the stigmata. And what, the stigmata, what is, kind of the higher sense of the 5 wounds, right? And the example of St. Francis bearing the stigmata. And as we get toward the end here, he anticipates where he's going, and he talks about the 3 symbols in Christianity and occultism: the cross, the pentagram, and the hexagram. This is on page 118. And he connects the cross to the vow and virtue of obedience. Right? That is the sign and formula of faith. It's horizontal human respiration and vertical divine respiration united together. And remember, he likes these crosses, and this is the cross, right? Which brings in human respiration and vertical divine respiration united together. The pentagram is initiative. It is effort and work. That is the vow and virtue of poverty, where the sign and formula of hope is the effect of the presence of divine light here below. The hexagram is the vow and virtue of chastity. That is the sign and formula of love, as the unity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Mother, Daughter, and Holy Soul. In this, he kind of drops this little hint of the Mother, Daughter, and the Holy Soul. But a lot of people, whoa, I never heard of them. Now, in letter 19 on the Son, he gets into it quite heavily. It explains it quite a bit. And this might be, this may prove to be Tomberg's major contribution to Catholic theology sometime in the future, bringing in this idea of the Mother, the Daughter, and the Holy Soul. And it's very sophological, but it's not theologically fleshed out here. It's kind of intuitively represented or poetically represented. But it's something to keep in mind. The Mother, the Daughter, and the Holy Soul. How do we incorporate that into our spiritual lives, our prayer life? And what does it mean? We'll get to it later. And finally, he tells us that the post of Pope or the Holy See is a formula of divine magic, just as the post of the Emperor is in the history of humanity. It is what is meant by the esoteric term Petrus, Peter, the rock. Petrus is the term in the Old and in the New Testament designating the divine, immovable ordinance or formula of divine magic. This is why the post of Pope was founded upon the quality of Petrus. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. It's from Matthew 16:18. The 5 gates of hell, he says, the will to greatness, the desire to take and to keep, the desire to advance and to hold on to at the expense of others, being the counter formula, shall not prevail against the formula of the 5 wounds. And these wounds are the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So let's hold on to that, this idea of the keys of the kingdom, those 5 wounds. Now, are they the 5 wounds of grasping, of the will in your life? Or are they wounds connected to the vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity? And how do we do that? I mean, it takes a long time to work it out. But I have faith that we can. And then, I'll see you next time.